Your bank can hand your entire financial life to the government. Every check you've written, every deposit that gets made, every transfer. No warrant, no probable cause, no judge weighing evidence before the intrusion. And they don't have to tell you. This is the law in America. It has been for nearly 50 years. And one Supreme Court case made sure it was read that way. But it goes beyond just others getting access to your bank records. As one woman found out, watching can turn into blocking from your own money in your own bank account. And we'll cover all this by me simply telling you a few stories. With the first one about a man who found out that government officials didn't need a warrant to get his confidential records. They just needed to ask his banker nicely. Late 1972, rural Georgia. Federal agents were investigating an alleged illegal whiskey operation. They believed a man named Mitch Miller was involved. In 1973, agents from the Treasury Department went to 2 banks where Miller held accounts. The banks handed the agents Miller's banking history, microfilm copies of Miller's checks, deposit slips, financial statements, monthly account records. Miller only found out after his records were already in the government's hands. He was indicted. At trial, his lawyers moved to suppress the bank records, arguing they were obtained in violation of the Fourth Amendment, that amendment that guarantees a warrant before searching a person's home or possessions. The case reached the Supreme Court. April 21st, 1976. Justice Lewis Powell delivered the opinion. 7 justices joined. Powell's reasoning began with a premise. The bank records weren't Miller's private papers. They were the bank's business records. The checks weren't confidential communications. They were negotiable instruments to be used in commercial transactions. And the information in them had been voluntarily conveyed to the banks and exposed to their employees in the ordinary course of business. Then Powell wrote the line that would define financial privacy in America for the next half century. The depositor takes the risk in revealing his affairs to another, that the information will be conveyed by that person to the government. Even if you assumed your bank would keep your information confidential, even if the bank told you it would, you took the risk. 2 justices sitting on that same court, however, saw something different. Justice William Brennan saw where this could lead and why Fourth Amendment protections are important, especially with a person's banking records. He referred to a California Supreme Court case to make his point. To permit a police officer access to these records merely upon his request opens the door to a vast and unlimited range of very real abuses of police power. Justice Brennan also pointed to a reality the majority's reasoning ignored. Participating in modern economic life requires a bank account. The disclosure isn't voluntary. It's compelled by the basic structure of society. He continued, for all practical purposes, the disclosure by individuals or business firms of their financial affairs to a bank is not entirely volitional, since it is impossible to participate in the economic life of contemporary society without maintaining a bank account. He then used a quote that put it more starkly. In the course of such dealings, a depositor reveals many aspects of his personal affairs, opinions, habits, and associations. Indeed, the totality of bank records provides a virtual current biography. And this was 1976, before the commercial internet, before electronic banking, before algorithms tracked every swipe of a card. The California court decision quoted by Brennan continued, development of photocopying machines, electronic computers, and other sophisticated instruments have accelerated the ability of government to intrude into areas which a person normally chooses to exclude from prying eyes. Judicial interpretations of the reach of the constitutional protection of individual privacy must keep pace with the perils created by these new devices. Justice Thurgood Marshall saw it too, and he saw the court was not just getting it wrong, but refusing to acknowledge what was happening. I wash my hands of today's extended redundancy by the court. That redundancy, Marshall believed the act that required banks to maintain these records in the first place in itself was against the Constitution. And here's the government taking the records that it forced the bank to create in the first place. Brennan saw something. Marshall saw something. The California Supreme Court saw something. But the majority didn't. April 1976. The Supreme Court declared that Americans have no Fourth Amendment protection in their bank records. But the court didn't create the surveillance system. By 1976, federal law had already required banks to microfilm checks, to maintain records for years, to report cash transactions to the Treasury Department. The architecture was already built. What Miller did was seal the exits. Once the court ruled that you had no constitutional ground to challenge that system, the question became something else. Not whether the government could access your financial life, because the court already said that they could. The new question now was, how far would the government go in using those records against the individuals? And what new powers over your life would that system claim? Here's how the system seems to work today. We don't have a full picture because most of it is done secretly. So based on the scattered news accounts, here is how the system seems to be working today. You have a bank account. Your paycheck goes in, your bills go out, normal financial life. But your bank isn't just holding your money. It's watching you. Its software scans your transactions every night, looking for patterns, deviations, statistical anomalies. Maybe you made a series of cash deposits. Maybe you withdrew money more frequently than usual. Maybe you wired funds overseas to a perfectly lawful destination that the system happens to classify as elevated risk. The algorithm flags it. A compliance officer reviews it. Then the bank files a suspicious activity report. You were not notified. The government claims the bank has immunity, and it forbids the bank to tell you a report was filed. So you wake up one day and your account doesn't work. Debit card declined. Online access frozen. You call the bank. They tell you they can't discuss the matter. You haven't been arrested. You haven't even been charged. And most times there's not even an accusation. There was no warrant, no hearing, no judge. Just an automated system and an internal decision you're not allowed to know about. So you try a different bank. The new bank runs the checks. Under the USA Patriot Act, banks can freely share information with each other about customers who may be associated with money laundering risks. Not money laundering per se, just risks. They see indicators, not proof, not charges, just risk categories. And to them, you're a liability. They decline to open the account. They don't have to tell you why. You try another bank, same result. Being denied entry into the banking system isn't a small inconvenience. It's a lockout from modern life. Checking accounts, direct deposit, online bill pay, credit cards, mortgages, all of it depends on access to a system you're now barred from. And when you ask the government what happened, they shrug. They say banks make independent business decisions. All these changes occur, but the Fourth Amendment is still there. It hasn't been repealed. The Fourth Amendment says the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. The reality of an America where bank records are taken without a warrant, all while the Fourth Amendment still is the law of the land, didn't happen all at once. The founders wrote secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects, because what they had lived through. June 8, 1789, New York City. The first Congress of the United States. James Madison rose to speak. The Constitution had been ratified, but several states had demanded a condition, a Bill of Rights. Without it, they warned, the new government would become the very thing they had fought a revolution to escape. Madison proposed amendments. I think we should obtain the confidence of our fellow citizens, in proportion as we fortify the rights of the people against the encroachments of the government. Among his proposals, words that would become the Fourth Amendment. The rights to be secured in their persons, their houses, their papers. Madison believed the courts would enforce these words. They would be, he said, an impenetrable bulwark against every assumption of power in the legislative or executive. An impenetrable bulwark. December 15th, 1791, the Bill of Rights was ratified. 100 years later, the Supreme Court proved Madison right, even if it later changed its mind. The system we live in today is a new phenomenon. It had no place in America for over 100 years, and a Supreme Court case proves that. Edward A. Boyd and Sons imported plate glass. The government suspected they hadn't paid proper customs duties. To prove its case, it obtained a court order compelling Boyd to produce his invoices, his private business papers. Boyd objected. The case reached the Supreme Court. Justice Joseph Bradley wrote for a unanimous court. The government's argument was simple. This wasn't a search. No one broke down a door. No one rifled through drawers. They just asked for documents. Documents they claimed Boyd had to provide. Justice Bradley rejected it. Compelling a man to produce his private papers, the court held, was no different than seizing them. The Fourth Amendment's protection didn't depend on physical intrusion. It is not the breaking of his doors and the rummaging of his drawers that constitutes the essence of the offense, but it is the invasion of the indefeasible right of personal security, personal liberty, and private property. Not the breaking of doors, the invasion of the right itself. The court ruled for Boyd. Congress's customs law was unconstitutional. Then Bradley issued a warning. Illegitimate and unconstitutional practices get their first footing in that way, namely by silent approaches and slight deviations from legal modes of procedure. It is the duty of the courts to be watchful for the constitutional rights of the citizens and against any stealthy encroachments thereon. Silent approaches, slight deviations, stealthy encroachments. The courts would be watching. Madison wrote the words. Boyd gave them teeth. For 100 years, the Fourth Amendment meant what it said. Then came a war. 6 months after America entered the Great War, the First World War, Congress passed the Trading with the Enemy Act. The law gave the president extraordinary powers, controlling trade, seizing property, regulating financial transactions with enemy nations. At the time, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, countries that would soon cease to exist. Section 5B was explicit. The president could regulate foreign exchange, transfers of credit, movements of currency during time of war. The war ended November 11, 1918. The law remained. March 9, 1933. The Great Depression had entered its fourth year. Banks were failing. People lined up to withdraw their savings. The financial system was collapsing. Franklin Roosevelt had been president for 5 days. He needed emergency powers. He found them in a law written for a war against countries that no longer existed. It gave the president emergency power only during war. But that would change. Congress amended Section 5B. The added 12 words changed everything. During time of war, or during any other period of national emergency declared by the president. A wartime power had now become a power for any occasion the president so declared. By 1934, Roosevelt was using it to regulate foreign exchange transactions and credit transfers between American banks and foreign banks. Roosevelt even outlawed the ownership of gold. The Great Depression eventually ended. The power didn't. By June 1945, World War II was drawing to a close. A new president, a new crisis. Not bank runs, Nazi plunder moving through neutral banks, black marketers evading wartime price controls, and Americans hiding money in foreign accounts to escape taxes. 3 problems, all sharing one common thread: money moving across borders invisible to the government. The Treasury Department sought visibility. It found its authority in the same place Roosevelt had, the Trading with the Enemy Act. June 5, 1945. A new regulation required financial institutions to report cash transactions of $10,000 or more. Compliance was discretionary. Banks could skip reporting if the transaction seemed consistent with the customer's normal business. The surveillance of Americans' financial transactions had begun, not through a law debated on constitutional grounds, not through a statute weighed against the Fourth Amendment, through a regulation issued under an emergency power for an emergency that had passed. By 1952, the discretion was gone. Reporting became mandatory, but Treasury knew the foundation was shaky. Officials later admitted they never felt fully confident that these regulations had a sufficient statutory basis for full and complete enforcement. Translation, they didn't think the law allowed what they were doing. The power needed a permanent home. October 26, 1970. A new president, a new Congress. The same crisis. Americans evading taxes, money flowing to secret accounts. Treasury officials came to Capitol Hill. The emergency regulation, they explained, has proved to be inadequate. So Congress gave them something permanent, a law eventually known as the Bank Secrecy Act. Banks would photograph checks, maintain records for years, report transactions over $10,000 to the Treasury Department. The $10,000 threshold, the same number from the earlier regulation, carried forward now into a statute. Once the law was in place, the old regulation was quietly shelved. Its work was done. The Fourth Amendment wasn't debated. The Boyd case wasn't cited. The question of whether compelling a man to produce his private papers was the obnoxious thing in its mildest form never raised. But the Bank Secrecy Act is not the name of that law. Its full name is the Currency and Foreign Transactions Reporting Act. And in that Currency and Foreign Transaction Act is Section 223A. The Secretary may, in his discretion, designate domestic financial institutions, individually or by class, as agents of the United States. Agents of the United States. Banks. Nearly everything that established this, monitoring, reporting, information sharing, federal penalties, bank immunity, comes from federal law. And the continuation of all of this rests on one Supreme Court decision from 1976, United States versus Miller, a case where the government suspected a man was making illegal whiskey, went to his bank without a warrant, and walked away with Miller's financial life, with a majority of the Supreme Court agreeing with it. That ruling actually sparked outcry, letters to Congress, newspaper editorials, citizens quoting the Fourth Amendment, invoking the warnings of the dissenting justices. Congress heard it. 2 years later, it passed a law whose name sounded like restoration. The Right to Financial Privacy Act of 1978, a right to privacy. For the financial records the Supreme Court had just ruled weren't yours. The name promised reform. What Congress wrote was something else. November 10th, 1978, President Jimmy Carter signs the Right to Financial Privacy Act. The name sounds like something that would, well, back up individual rights, a right to financial privacy. For the records the Supreme Court had recently ruled weren't protected, a right that now Congress was saying it was working to restore. But reforms aren't always what their labels imply. And the key issue to all this was the warrant. A warrant requires probable cause. A warrant requires an official of the executive branch to swear an oath affirming that what they're telling the judge is true and was lawfully obtained. A judge reviews the evidence, and a law enforcement official must swear an oath and convince a member of another branch of government, that judge, that there's reason to believe a crime has been committed, and that the reasons that they have, the evidence, was lawfully obtained. Checks and balances, not just at the national level, but at the level where the government can reach out and take your things and put you away. That's what Miller argued for. That's what the dissenting justices pointed to. That's what people were demanding. But Congress chose something else. The Right to Financial Privacy Act gave the government 5 different ways to get your records. A warrant was just one of those ways, instead of the only one. One of the menu of options that was provided in this law was something called an administrative subpoena, issued not by a court, but by the agency itself. The standard? The agency has reason to believe the records are relevant to a legitimate law enforcement inquiry. Relevant, legitimate. Words the agency defines for itself. The stated purpose of the bill when it was first introduced, however, to ensure that customers have the same right to protection against unwarranted disclosure of customer records as if the records were in their possession. But the final version of that bill that became law gave 4 unwarranted options to get your records. By 1979, the system not only survived reform, but actually used reform to make itself stronger. Before 1992, banks had something called a criminal referral form. It existed to report crimes inside the bank, employee theft, insider fraud, banks policing their own. In 1992, Congress passed the Annunzio Wiley Anti-Money Laundering Act. It didn't create a new form. It gave the Treasury Department authority to require banks to report any suspicious transaction relevant to a possible violation of law or regulation. Possible. By 1996, the criminal referral form was gone. In its place, the suspicious activity report. Same basic mechanism. Banks report to government, but pointed in a different direction. The CRF watched bank employees. The SAR watches customers. And this was on top of what banks already did. The Bank Secrecy Act of 1970 required automatic reports of any transaction over $10,000. That was mechanical. A number triggered a form. The SAR asked for something different. Judgment. What even was suspicious? The federal government had an answer, written into federal codification. Transactions with no business or apparent lawful purpose. Activity not the sort in which the particular customer would normally be expected to engage. Banks weren't just keeping records anymore. They were watching customers and reporting what they saw to the federal government. And Congress gave them 2 things in return. The first, secrecy. The law forbids banks from telling customers a SAR has been filed. You have no right to know it exists. no right to see what it says, no right to respond, even if it's erroneous, even if it's impacting your financial life. The second thing given to the banks, immunity. A bank cannot be sued for filing a suspicious activity report, even if the report turns out to be wrong, even if it's filed in bad faith. Your bank can report you to the federal government as suspicious. You may feel the effects, frozen out of your account. You can't create a new one, and you may never find out why. The government knows the answer. The banks know the answer. You're the one left with questions. September 11th, 2001, 45 days later. Congress passed the USA Patriot Act. The law didn't replace the Bank Secrecy Act. It extended its reach to every financial institution in America. And Section 314 of the Patriot Act went further. It created something new. Banks could now share information about customers with each other. Under Section 314B, they can exchange information about individuals, entities, and organizations for the purpose of identifying activities that may involve money laundering or terrorist financing. May involve is merely suspicion, and Treasury already defines suspicious as something different than expected. The penalties for failing to comply with reporting to the government increase as well. Fines could now reach twice the transaction amount, or $1 million. The incentive structure was clear. No penalty for handing over customer information. Heavy penalties for not handing it over. Complete immunity for reporting someone as suspicious. No immunity for staying silent. Banks responded the way any institution would respond. They hired compliance officers, built monitoring systems, created algorithms to flag unusual activity, and they filed. In 2006, financial institutions filed just over 1 million suspicious activity reports. By 2023, they filed 4.6 million. And these reports filed in secret, with no notice to those reported and complete immunity for those doing the reporting. These aren't numbers. These are people. Many people who have never been accused of a crime, never charged, never committed a crime, never given a hearing. They're flagged, accounts locked, funds held, even frozen out of banking completely. Why? Because the penalties for a bank that misses one bad transaction are measured in government fines of millions of dollars. To eliminate this risk, banks practice de-risking, using the SAR and Section 314B reports as their trigger. A report from a bank that may not even be accurate is used to freeze or close an individual's account, and often across multiple banks, with no trial. New York, February 2021. A working mother of 4 went to use her debit card. It didn't work. She called her bank. Both her checking and savings accounts were frozen. When she went to the branch, they told her the account was closed for suspicious activity. No specifics, no timeline, no appeal. The bank basically said, we can't touch it. For more than 2 months, she couldn't access her own money. She had to ask her adult children to cover her. She couldn't even buy a sandwich on her own. And it was only after a local TV news investigation contacted her bank that she got her money back. Weeks later, no charges were ever filed, no crime was ever alleged. Just an algorithm, a compliance decision, and a woman locked out of her own life. And her only help was to get a local television news channel to intervene. Making public seems to be the only thing that matters in the Bank Secrecy Act. The Bank Secrecy Act is a statute, a law, passed by Congress, signed by the President. But the rules that govern your financial life today, the specific requirements, the definitions, the penalties, they aren't in the statute. They're in the Code of Federal Regulations, written by the Treasury Department. And Treasury can designate banks as its agents. In 1886, Justice Bradley warned of silent approaches and slight deviations from legal modes of procedure. In 1976, Justice Brennan warned that bank records had become a virtual current biography. Today, that biography is written every time you swipe a card, and your bank sends those chapters to the federal government without telling you, without a warrant, without a judge. Just your bank and the government it reports to. To learn about other quiet mechanisms that can and often do impact your life, and not always for the better, check out my Plain Meaning channel on YouTube for more episodes. And if you watch them all, don't worry, because I release a new one every Tuesday.